At 66, when the world had already written its verdict about him, there was still something left unsaid. They called him the godfather of punk, the body that moved like a whip, the voice that tore through silence, the chaos that refused to be caged. Iggy Pop was more than a performer. He was a force, a wound, a rebellion given human shape. But behind the sweat and broken glass, behind the stage dives and the screaming crowds, there lived a man who carried his own secret list of names. Lovers not of the spotlight, but of the shadows. Some fleeting, some lasting, all unforgettable. He remembered them not with regret, but with a kind of reverence, as if each left a scar he wore like a medal. The first was passion, wild and short, like fire licking at paper until nothing remained. The second, quieter, a comfort in nights when fame felt like exile. But one name, stayed buried deeper than the rest. A man who saw past the madness, who touched the stillness Iggy never showed to the crowd. A man who reminded him that beneath the storm was a boy who longed to be understood. I was untouchable on stage, Iggy once whispered, but in his arms I was breakable. That was the truth he never sang, the lyric that never made it into any record. It wasn't the kind of story the world wanted then, and maybe not even now. But it was his story, not tabloid invention, not rumor, memory. And if you listen closely in the silences between his songs, you can still hear it. The ache of what was lost, and the unshakable beauty of what was real. Elton John. Elton John, the man behind the glitter, they called him Rocket Man, the genius draped in feathers and sequins, the showman who turned the piano into fire. Elton John was spectacle, a blaze of color in a world that often demanded gray. His voice carried across stadiums, his songs became hymns of generations, and his presence on stage felt larger than life itself. To millions he was untouchable, the living crown jewel of music. But beneath the glasses, behind the glitter, there was always a quieter truth. Elton's life was not only about applause. It was about loneliness, about battles fought in silence, about hearts given and broken behind closed doors. For all the flamboyance, for all the laughter and outrageous costumes, there was a man who wanted nothing more than to be held without expectation. He remembered them, not the fans, not the producers, but the men who passed through his life when no one was watching. Some names faded quickly, vanishing like smoke after a concert encore. Others stayed longer, steadying him when the world spun too fast. And then there was one name, the one he never spoke aloud, not even in his wildest interviews. The man who had seen him stripped of fame, who had kissed him not as Elton John, but as Reginald, the boy from Pinner, in that memory. Elton was not the star, not the legend, not the rocket man. He was simply human, vulnerable, afraid, alive. I wrote love into songs, he once admitted in a whisper, because I couldn't always say it out loud. And in that sentence lived the weight of decades, the ache of hiding, the cost of fame, the tenderness of what was lost. This was not scandal. This was not rumor. It was history, pressed into memory, carried in silence. And like every great Elton John ballad, it was beautiful because it was true. Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney, the melody of memory, they called him the cute Beatle, the voice that made the world believe in love songs again. Paul McCartney was not just a musician, he was a phenomenon, a heartbeat that carried across oceans, a sound that defined an era. To the world, he was eternal youth, smiling eyes, melodies that felt like sunshine, bottled in 3 minutes. But to those who knew him closely, there was always more. Behind the fame, behind the whirlwind of screaming crowds and endless tours, Paul carried with him a quieter rhythm, a rhythm of longing, of love both found and hidden. His life was a gallery of names, some public, many private. Lovers who saw him not as a Beatle, but as a man. They didn't hear the cheers of stadiums. They heard his silences, his laughter at midnight, his voice breaking when he sang not to the world but to one person alone. There was one name, however, that Paul never let slip into songs. A name he protected fiercely, a memory folded carefully like an old lyric sheet tucked away in a drawer. That man was not dazzled by fame. He did not bow to the legend. He looked at Paul and saw the boy from Liverpool, the son who carried grief, the dreamer who wanted something beyond music. In that presence, Paul was allowed to be fragile, to break, to love without melody. I wrote the greatest songs of my life, Paul once said. but the one I lived with him never found its chorus. And in that admission lay a universe of silence. A silence heavier than applause, more lasting than fame. This was not gossip, not a fan's fantasy. It was history of another kind. History written in memory, in longing, in the secret harmony between two souls. A harmony the world never heard, but one Paul never forgot. Mick Jagger. Mick Jagger, the dangerous dance. They called him the greatest frontman in rock history. Mick Jagger, the strut, the sneer, the voice that turned every stage into a battlefield. To the world he was pure electricity, a body in constant motion, a man who could command thousands with a single gesture. Women desired him, men envied him, and fame seemed stitched into his very skin. Yet for all the decadence, for all the excess that followed the Rolling Stones like a storm cloud, Mick carried within him something more fragile, more human. He lived in a world of fleeting nights and nameless faces. But among the noise there were names that stayed. Lovers who didn't care about the stage, who didn't want the legend, who wanted only the man behind the roar. To them, Mick was not the peacock in tight pants, not the swaggering icon of rebellion. He was vulnerable, restless, even afraid. And in that vulnerability he found a kind of truth he rarely spoke of. There was one name in particular, buried deeper than the others. A man who matched Mick's fire, who refused to be dazzled by fame. He saw through the armor, through the endless strut and glittering mask. With him, Mick was not a rock god, but simply a man searching for something real. In stolen hours they shared not just desire, but understanding, a meeting of equals in a world that treated Mick like a commodity. "I could own the stage," Mick once whispered in confidence, but with him I was owned by honesty. That was the secret no song ever told, no headline ever guessed. It wasn't scandal. It wasn't fiction. It was memory, raw, unpolished, and as dangerous as the man himself. Mick Jagger was the embodiment of movement, but some parts of him stood still. Still with longing, still with silence, still with the weight of a love that the world was never meant to see. And yet, it lived on, not in tabloids, not in rumors, but in the unshakable truth of a man who had everything and still wanted more. Roger Waters. Roger Waters. The Wall of Silence. They called him the architect of sound, the mind behind the walls and the echoes, the man who turned anger and longing into anthems that still shake stadiums today. Roger Waters was brilliance sharpened into music, a poet of rebellion, a builder of worlds in which loneliness could finally speak. To the world he was uncompromising, even merciless, a leader who demanded perfection, a visionary both admired and feared. But beyond the music, beyond the legend of Pink Floyd, there was a man who carried his own private list of names. Roger's life was measured not only in albums and tours, but in silences. The silences after the crowds were gone, the silences where memory came alive. In those silences he remembered the men who had touched his life, not through applause, but through presence. Some were fleeting, burning bright, then fading quickly. Others lasted longer, companions through the endless cycles of creation and collapse. Yet one name lived apart from all the rest. A man who stood in the shadow of the stage yet never looked at him as an idol. Someone who saw through the fire and fury, who found the fragile boy inside the storm. With him, Roger could step down from the pedestal. He could laugh, he could break, he could be more than the myth the world demanded. "I built walls for the world," Roger once said in a moment of rare honesty, but with him, I wanted to tear them down. That confession was never written in liner notes, never caught in interviews. It was spoken only in memory, carved into the silence he kept closest. This was not scandal. It was not fantasy. It was history, the kind written not in magazines but in the private language of longing. Roger Waters gave the world the wall, but behind it he kept a secret, that even visionaries, even rebels, even giants of music carry names they dare not say aloud. Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan, the Song of Shadows, they called him the voice of a generation. Bob Dylan, the poet with the guitar, the restless wanderer who turned words into weapons and silence into prophecy. To the world he was a mystery wrapped in song, a man who refused to be defined, who slipped through fame's fingers like smoke. He was rebellion and poetry, thunder and whisper. Yet behind the harmonica, behind the gravel voice that carried across decades, there was a quieter story, one he rarely allowed to escape. Dylan's life was scattered with names, with faces that drifted in and out of the endless road. Some were companions of the journey, others only brief sparks against the long night. But a few left marks deeper than any lyric, men whose presence shaped him in ways the public would never know. They did not see the folk hero, the protest singer, the Nobel laureate. They saw only the man, weary, sharp-eyed, vulnerable when the world wasn't watching. One name in particular lingered in his memory. A man who spoke not of legend, but of truth. Someone who listened not to Dylan the performer, but to Dylan the human being. With him, there was no stage, no audience, no curtain to hide behind. There was only conversation, laughter, silence. The kind of silence that felt safe instead of heavy. For a fleeting time, he allowed Dylan to step outside the myth. "I wrote him into songs the world never heard," Dylan admitted once, voice low, almost ashamed, "because some stories are too true to share." That was the secret he carried, the shadow behind the anthems. Not rumor, not gossip, memory. And though the world will always remember Dylan as the prophet of music, he himself remembered something else. A man, a name, a love tucked away in the margins of history, a truth never sung on stage, but one, that played forever in the back of his mind, like a hidden refrain only he could hear. David Gilmour, David Gilmour. The quiet horizon, they called him the architect of sound. David Gilmour, the soaring guitar of Pink Floyd, the man who could bend a single note until it felt like the sky itself was breaking. His music was vast, atmospheric, carrying listeners into places they didn't know existed within themselves. To the world, he was a legend, a calm center in a band torn by storms. But legends are only ever half the story. In the quiet moments between tours when the lights dimmed and the stage emptied, Gilmour carried a secret that never made its way into interviews or liner notes. It wasn't rebellion or scandal. It was something far more fragile. A memory. A man, a connection that lived in silence. He had been there during the years of chaos when the band's genius threatened to consume itself. He wasn't another musician or a shadow in the studio. He was simply someone who listened, who offered stillness in a world made of noise. They would meet in hidden corners of London, away from the lenses, away from the endless debates about egos and records. Sometimes they said nothing at all, just shared the silence like a song only they understood. Gilmour, usually composed and guarded, allowed himself to unspool in those moments, not as a rock god, but as a man searching for peace. When asked years later what kept him steady during the height of Pink Floyd's madness, Gilmour once murmured, "I had someone who reminded me I was more than the music." He never gave a name, he never explained, but those who knew him best said there were stories folded into his guitar solos, melodies that carried private echoes. Perhaps that's why his notes could make strangers weep. They weren't just music, they were confessions no one else was allowed to hear. And among them, hidden like a horizon just out of reach, was the memory of the man who had seen him not as David Gilmour the legend, but simply as David.